The small church sat on the edge of town, its wooden steeple pointing toward the heavens, like a finger of hope against a sky streaked with twilight, and its steps worn down by decades of Sunday feet, now carried the weight of a story no one in the parish would ever forget, a story that began with a baby's cry and ended with the sound of a rancher's whisper. She had come there trembling, her shawl clutched tight around her thin shoulders, her eyes darting in fear at every shadow, as though the whole world might rise up and condemn her. No one knew her name, not really, for she was just another face from the weary edges of town, a young woman with a baby bundled in her arms, shivering against the cold. The child whimpered first, then let out a piercing cry, and that sound seemed to shatter her will. She collapsed onto the stone steps, rocking the tiny bundle in desperation, whispering apologies between sobs. "I'm so sorry. I can't give you what you need. I can't." Her tears fell fast, spotting the baby's thin blanket, her heart aching with the knowledge that this small church was her last refuge, her only chance to leave her child in the hands of mercy. She looked around as though the night itself would judge her, and in her heart she wondered if God would forgive her for what she was about to do. But then the door of the church creaked open, and a faint golden light spilled out across the stone steps, catching the moment like a scene painted in heaven's brushstrokes. Inside, the pastor and his wife heard the cries and hurried to the door, their hands trembling when they saw the young woman huddled there. "Child, what are you doing?" the pastor's wife whispered, bending to lift the blanket just enough to see the baby's tiny face red from crying. The young woman looked up, her eyes hollow and desperate, and whispered only 4 words before running into the shadows of the night. "Please, save my baby." And then she was gone, her footsteps fading until only the sound of the baby's cries filled the air. The pastor's wife cradled the child, her heart breaking for the unknown mother who vanished into the dark, while the pastor bowed his head, already knowing this was more than a chance moment. It was a crossroads. News spread quickly through the town by morning. Some wagged their heads in judgment, whispering that the mother was careless, shameful, while others spoke softly, seeing only tragedy and pain. But in the midst of those voices was a silence that drew more attention than the loudest. Gossip, the silence of a rancher named Eli Brooks. He was a man whose presence filled a room even when he said nothing, whose broad shoulders carried more weight than most men dared to bear, and whose eyes, though quiet, carried storms. Years ago, he had buried his wife and child after a fire swept through their ranch house, and from that day forward his words had been few, his heart locked away behind walls no one could reach. Folks said Eli's grief had turned him to stone, that the ranch was his only companion now, spread wide and lonely across the Montana plains. But when he heard about the baby left at the church steps, something in his chest stirred for the first time in years, something restless and aching. That night, while others sat around their tables speaking of the incident, Eli saddled his horse and rode under the silver gaze of the moon straight to the church. The pastor and his wife were there, rocking the child near the fireplace, whispering prayers for its future. When the heavy boots of the rancher echoed in the doorway, he stood there tall with his hat in hand, his eyes fixed not on them but on the child. The silence stretched, thick as a rope pulled tight until finally, in a voice that rasped like wind over gravel, Eli spoke the first words he had shared in months. "That baby needs a home." The pastor looked at him with surprise, his wife holding the child tighter, uncertain of this man whose sorrow was known by all. "Brother Eli," the pastor began carefully, "taking in a child is no small thing. Are you certain?" But Eli lifted his eyes then, and though words were few, they carried weight deeper than a riverbed. "I buried one child already," he whispered, his voice breaking like a crack in stone. "God gave me another chance. I won't turn away." With that, he reached out his arms, roughened by ranch work yet trembling with tenderness, and when the pastor's wife laid the baby into them, something holy seemed to settle in the room. The baby quieted as though recognizing safety in his embrace, and Eli bowed his head, pressing his lips to the child's brow. For the first time in years his eyes watered, and though he said nothing more, everyone present understood. The silent rancher had chosen to make this abandoned child his own. Word spread again through town, only this time the whispers held awe. Some wondered how a man who had shut himself off from the world could suddenly open his heart to a child not his blood, while others quietly gave thanks that God had placed that baby into the arms of a protector so steady. Eli returned to his ranch, cradling the baby as though he carried something more precious than gold, and the wide, lonely land that had once felt like a prison now seemed alive with promise. Each night he whispered softly to the child, words no one else heard, promises carved in the silence, of a man who had once lost everything, but was now determined to guard what he had been given. The baby's cry had changed everything. It had broken the heart of a grieving rancher, softened the stones of sorrow, and rewritten a story no one expected. And though the woman who had left her child at the church steps might never know, her desperate act of surrender had been the seed of redemption, both for her baby and for the silent rancher who had whispered the vow that would shape both their lives. You're safe now. You're mine. The days that followed were unlike anything Eli Brooks had known in years, for the ranch that had once echoed only with the sound of wind and cattle now carried the soft cries and laughter of a baby whose presence was rewriting every corner of his world. Eli named her Hope, because that was what she had given him without knowing. And though some folks in town raised their brows at the idea of a man like Eli raising a child alone, others quietly nodded, believing that maybe God had chosen him for just this purpose. At first, life with the baby was not easy. Eli's hands, used to gripping reins and rope, fumbled with bottles and blankets, and his nights were filled with sleepless pacing across the floorboards while Hope wailed against the silence of the night. More than once, he sat in the old rocking chair with tears sliding down his weathered cheeks, whispering, I don't know if I can do this, little one, but I'll never let you down. And though his voice cracked, though his heart still carried the ache of the family he'd lost, there was something about the weight of her in his arms, the way her tiny fingers curled around his thumb, that gave him strength he didn't know he still had. As the weeks turned into months, Eli began to change. Neighbors noticed how the man who once avoided conversation now walked through town with a baby on his hip, his hat tipped low but his steps steady. And while he didn't speak much, his presence spoke louder than words. That love, when chosen, could heal even the deepest wounds. Yet not everyone in town was kind. There were whispers in corners, people who muttered that the child should have been sent to an orphanage, that Eli was a fool to tie himself to a burden that wasn't his blood. One man at the saloon even laughed and said, that baby'll grow up never knowing her real folks. What kind of life is that? But Eli didn't flinch, didn't respond, because for him, Hope wasn't a question of blood or name. She was his because he had chosen her, and nothing anyone said could shake that. Still, there were nights he wondered about the woman who had left her on those church steps. Where had she gone? Was she alive? Did she regret what she had done? He would sit by the fire with Hope asleep against his chest, staring into the flames, and in his silence, he prayed that wherever she was, she might somehow know that her child was safe, that she was loved. Little did he know, the story was far from over. Because months later, on a stormy evening when the sky cracked open with thunder and the rain beat hard against the earth, a figure appeared at the edge of the ranch. Eli had just put Hope down in her small crib, her soft breathing a comfort in the chaos of the storm. When the dogs outside began to bark, he opened the door, shotgun in hand out of instinct, and there, drenched and trembling, stood a woman cloaked in shadows. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, and her eyes wide and haunted, fixed on him with a look he couldn't quite place. Please, she whispered, her voice nearly